Happy Sunday, everyone. This week, the church made an announcement that some feel is long overdue with how we treat young single adults in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So if you haven't heard the news about what was announced really quick, the age ranges were changed for who is considered a young single adult. So now, young single adult in the church refers to an unmarried Latter-day Saint age 18 through 35. That used to be 18 through 30. So people would age out of their singles wards and into a mid-singles ward, perhaps. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then beyond this, I want to talk about what do these trends suggest? Should we be worried? Is this a good thing? What's happening with the youth and the young adults in our church, and what does that mean for the future? So 18 to 35 is the new age range for young single adults, and now single adult without the young refers to an unmarried church member age 36 and up. It used to be 31. So they've shifted everything up by 5 years. They also announced, and I think this is important, that in concentrated areas, let's say in student wards near college campuses where you have a lot of young single adults, they can actually break the young single adult wards into two. So you'd have an 18 through 25 young single adult ward and a 26 to 35. And then single adult wards would be from 36 to 45.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
So kind of interesting and weird that in non-concentrated areas where you just have some scattered young adults in various stakes throughout the world, you can have 35-year-olds now attending the same single adult ward as an 18-year-old, which is basically half the age. That's a huge span. Sure, in the college areas, they're going to break it down into two, but everywhere else, you're going to have 35-year-olds going to a singles ward with 18-year-olds and being in their little FHE groups, if any of them still do that, and so forth. The mid-singles category is actually being dissolved. So this was previously the 31 through 45-year age range. I found this article a few years ago from a regional representative over single and mid-singles wards. This was in Orange County, California. 16 stakes is the region that this person was involved with. And he said that in each of the stakes in Orange County, there are on average 250 to 600 30-something mid-singles, so hundreds of these mid-singles. Continuing, he said, yet only a handful are active, often sitting alone in a family ward. So that's in California. It's one anecdote. But as I was digging into this, trying to get some of these anecdotes and hear what people were saying, there was a lot of this, that when Latter-day Saints, when Mormons would age out of their singles ward and they weren't yet married, sometimes they'd drift back into a family ward, but increasingly over the years, a lot of them just go inactive and don't feel like they have a home. They don't feel like they were successful in the dating world. And so they just kind of disconnect, and a lot of them just go inactive. Now, when did this all start? Because this approach to gathering young singles together with the hope of encouraging dating and marriage is actually a fairly recent thing. It's only been in the past half century or so. In 1956 is when the church created its first student units. This was at BYU, and they created 12 student wards. Each ward had between 300 to 700 members. And they did that for a quarter of a century. That was kind of the approach. And then finally in 1982, the first presidency announced the creation of singles wards. So before it was student wards, right? BYU really focused on the student experience. It wasn't until 1982 when singles wards were created. And the first presidency announced a new policy pertaining to wards for non-student single adult members of the church, because of course a lot of these young adults were graduating school. They were leaving the school, the student wards, and then the question was, what do we do with these people? Because increasingly a number of them are not getting married back in the 80s before they leave school, and that necessitated or prompted the creation of singles wards. 1982. 4 years later, 1986, the first presidency issued another letter directing that those who have formerly belonged to the church's young adult groups are now part of two new groups, young single adults and single adults. So they kind of broke it out into young and older because, again, a lot of these people were aging up into these older young adult years or adult years. and were still not married, but it was kind of weird to mix them all together. So they broke them into two in 1986. Now, in preparing for this, the quote that came to mind is the apocryphal Brigham Young quote that a lot of people would say, where an unmarried man, Latter-day Saint man over the age of 25 is a menace to society. That I don't even know that the apocryphal quote says Latter-day Saint man. It might just be generalized as unmarried men over 25 are menaces to society. And I remember when I got past 25, that was kind of the ho ho ho, the joke, oh, you're a menace to society, and kind of this cultural thing, at least back then, that people were aware of. They would say this, that Brigham Young once said it. Well, that's not true, which is why I mentioned that it's apocryphal. Brigham Young did not say that. It was popularized, I feel like, when his, great-great-great-grandson, Steve Young, was interviewed a number of years ago on 60 Minutes. And he, being unmarried, I believe at the time, which is why he brought it up, mentioned that, oh, yeah, my great-great-great-grandpa Brigham Young once said that, you're a menace to society if you reach this age. That's not true. Here's something that Brigham Young did say. This comes from 1868, and Brigham Young said, and I quote, "I will give each of the young men in Israel who have arrived at an age to marry a mission to go straight away and get married to a good sister, fence a city lot, lay out a garden and orchard, and make a home. And especially do not forget to plant a proper proportion of mulberry trees. This is the mission that I give to all the young men in Israel." 1868. So if, council holds, you bachelor men need to get married and plant some mulberry trees, that is the imperative. A decade later, George Cannon said something that does approach menace to society material. He said, and I quote, "Our boys, when they arrive at years of maturity and can take earn of a wife, should get married. And there should not be a lot of young men growing up in our midst who ought to be but are not married. While I do not make the remark to apply to individual cases, I am firmly of the opinion that a large number of unmarried men over the age of 24 years is a dangerous element in any community, and an element upon which society should look with a jealous eye. For every man, knowing himself, knows how his fellow man is constituted, and if men do not marry, they are too apt to do something worse. Then, brethren, encourage our young men to marry, and see that they are furnished employment so they can marry." We're going to talk about that employment piece in a moment, because what are the trends, what are the incentives, what are the motivating reasons why we've had this shift? And employment, I think, is an interesting one. But George Cannon, here he is saying if you're over 24, you're a dangerous element in society and you might do bad things. So since the mid-1800s, we fast forward to today, and increasingly, as I'll show in just a moment, we've had this long-standing trend of rising age of people's first marriages. And why is that? Well, there's a term that's been coined by a psychology professor at Clark University. I actually wrote a book on this called Emerging Adulthood, the Winding Road from the Late Teens Through the 20s. So he coined this term, emerging adulthood. He said that late teens and 20-somethings have, quote, created this new stage between adolescence and young adulthood. So, of course, many, many decades ago, it was you were an adult, you were truly kind of an adult, 18, even younger, you were working on the family farm or working the job, you had responsibilities, you kind of sprang into life and you were mature for that age. And the age of maturity has continued to increase, and the age of dependence on your parents has continued to increase, and so forth. So it's almost like the infantilization of our society, where we treat young adults like children, and the kind of launching age for them to reach independence and adulthood is much later. This is supported by the evidence. He talks about this in his book, of course, but some quick data points just to substantiate this claim that now we have this period of not, youth, teenage years, and then adulthood, but we have this new period in the middle called emerging adulthood, this broader spectrum of time. The share of American adults, here's statistic number one, the share of American adults with full-time jobs at age 21 went from 64% in 1980 down to 39% in 2021. So over 40 years, you had this decline from 64 to 39% of the number of 21-year-old American adults with full-time jobs. Stat number two, Looking at the 18 through 29-year-old demographic, the share of young adults living with their parents went, during that same 4-decade span of time, from 32% up to 52%. So this huge increase in the number of 18 to 29-year-old adults still living with their parents. The final stat I'll share here is that in 4 decades, the share of 25-year-olds with children dropped from 39% to 17%, more than half of 25-year-olds not having children by that age. Here's another psychology professor. I found this quote. He said that the timetable of young adulthood has been pushed forward, and the single transitional event that has been pushed forward the most is marriage. So let's talk about that. The marriage age is substantially changing, as you can see here in this chart. Going back to the 50s, 60s, and even 70s, you had men getting married at like age 23 on average, all the way up now to age 30. So the average age of a groom is now 30 years old, and the average age of a bride is 28 years old. This is using census data. Back in 1962, as a little snapshot looking earlier in that chart, 90% of 30-year-olds had been married at least once by that age. So 90%. By 2019, so fast forward 50 plus years, by 2019, only 51%. So it went from 90% to 51% of 30-year-olds being married. In the prime adult years, so looking at like 25 through 54, the share of married Americans dwindled more than 2/3, from more than 2/3 in 1990 to barely half today. So that's the share of married Americans during that prime age range of adulthood, 25 to 54, went from 2/3 down to barely half. Final stat here, roughly 1 in 10 adults cohabit with a partner. So everyone else in romantic terms outside of marriage just lives alone. What was interesting to me was looking at this chart, and you see really starting in the early 70s is when you have this rise in marriage age. And that caught my attention for reasons I'll disclose in just a moment. But before I disclose it, I want to share some other trends that I've been familiar with that seem to track charts like this one for marriage. Before sharing them, here's a broader chart for marriage, and you can see similarly 50s, 60s, it's low. You have the post-war baby boom, people getting married and getting into life. And in the decades past, it was, a little higher, but reasonably so. You can see leading through, the Depression and into the war and after, people were getting married, families were being formed, people were having children and trying to, work together and survive and thrive. But then again, you see starting in the early 70s, this, massive rise in the age of first marriages for individuals. So let's get into some of those other examples that I mentioned. Here, for example, is the growth in productivity and hourly compensation. And what you can see again in the early 70s is this disconnect. Productivity continues to rise, technology and automation and innovation and so forth, but compensation flattens. So previously they were tied together. As innovation was growing, so too was compensation. People were gaining wealth in proportion to the economy becoming more prosperous and dynamic. But in the early 70s, something happened that disconnected that, and compensation has been fairly stagnant, I'll call it, while innovation continues to increase. Here's another chart. This one is looking at real GDP and wages. So again, you see them all fairly tracked all through the 50s and 60s, but starting in the early 70s, you get this disconnect. And real GDP per capita continues to rise. Again, there's that innovation. The economy is humming, booming, new jobs and new products and, prices being lowered and so forth. And so GDP is boosting, but look at you see the bottom line is the real median weekly earnings of full-time workers. So this is another way to slice the same data, showing us that in the early 70s, something went crazy. Let's look at the next chart. So here, this is dual income working couples. And again, in the early 70s, you start to see this huge trend where both spouses increasingly start working, and the share of families in which the husband only is working goes from the high 30s all the way now down to the low 20s, and if not below that. This is a decade old. And so you had this rise of, mom rather than stay at home and care for the kids. Increasingly, there aren't any kids, or they're delaying marriage, and so mom is out there being a girl boss and working, and You got two dual income, no kids. You got a bunch of dinks, as they're called, bringing in more money to be able to pay the bills and save up enough, hopefully, for a home and a family. But now you've delayed, your family, which, as you'll see in a moment, delays childbearing years and thus reduces the number of children that these families are having, driven by these economic desires of women, or needs, you might be saying, in a lot of cases, of women to get into the workforce, even after being married, to still be generating sufficient income for the household. Here's a random one, but this is looking at the price of tomato can, a single Campbell's condensed tomato soup. And you can see all throughout the early 1900s, fairly flat, fairly stable, and then mid-1900s. But you get to the early 1970s, and all of a sudden you have this massive increase. Here, this is a chart that a lot of people are familiar with now, and it's been even worse in recent years if I were to grab an updated one. But here's cumulative inflation, looking from 1913 all the way till a few years ago. And you can see again in the early 70s, things begin to rise. Here's another chart. This one is looking at the national debt. Again, early 70s, now you have this massive spike. So what the heck happened in the early 70s to cause not only these economic trends, but also these economic trends are really just affecting people's life, their ability to provide for themselves, the ability to start families, and so forth. There's actually a website called WTFHappenedIn1971.com. And that's where I got some of these charts. They have a ton of others. This website basically catalogs, at least in an economic sense, this huge problem and trying to raise awareness of what the heck happened in 1971. Well, what did happen in 1971? What happened in the early 1970s to create this precipitous, difference in all the data that we were looking at? Well, that is when the United States, the world's leading economy, has the world reserve currency. That is when the United States went off the gold standard. So on August 15, 1971, Nixon announced that the U.S. would no longer officially trade dollars for gold. And so this marked the beginning of the age of fiat currency, in which money only had value because the government said so, and there was no restraint anymore, because before there was some restraint. Back in the 30s is when we were first disconnected from the gold standard and the first steps were made. Nixon is what dealt the final death blow in 1971. Before then, there was convertibility. People could exchange their debt and their dollars for gold. So there was some restraint on the ability of, politicians to just spend money and print more of it. But starting in 1971, that was removed. Now you've had this fiat currency standard. It has affected everything because money is really just a social lubricant. That's how we interact with one another, buying, selling, exchanging, and working, and so forth. And so it's just a social lubricant. It's just energy between people. And when you corrupt the money, you corrupt society. You corrupt families. There's a great book called The Bitcoin Standard that talks about not only just money in general, and later he talks about Bitcoin, but he makes this amazing point in there of just looking at intergenerational impacts of weak money, that when you do have these fiat money systems, it corrupts families. It skews incentives. It alters behavior. It minimizes people's ability to, get a home and have financial stability and therefore be able to bear children. And so you have these huge societal impacts just from manipulating the money supply. And despite these trends, church leaders have been trying to, sound a warning signal, encourage members of the church, young single adults, to get married. Here, for example, is then Elder Monson in 2011.
Now, I've thought a lot lately about you young men who are of an age to marry. But you have not yet felt to do so. I see lovely young ladies who desire to be married and raise families, and yet their opportunities are limited because so many young men are postponing marriage. This is not a new situation. Much has been said concerning this matter by past presidents of the church. I share with you just one or two examples of their counsel. Said President Harold B. Lee, "We are not doing our duty as holders of the priesthood when we go beyond the marriageable age and withhold ourselves from an honorable marriage to these lovely women." Close quote. President Gordon B. Hinckley said this: "My heart reaches out to our single sisters who long for marriage and cannot seem to find it. I have far less sympathy for the young men who, under the customs of our society, have the prerogative to take the initiative in these matters, but in so many cases fail to do so." Close quote. I realize there are many reasons why you may be hesitating to take that step of getting married. If you're concerned about providing financially for a wife and a family, may I assure you that there's no shame in a couple having to scrimp and save. It is generally during these challenging times that you will grow closer together as you learn to sacrifice and to make difficult decisions. Perhaps you're afraid of making the wrong choice. To this I say that you need to exercise faith. Find someone with whom you can be compatible. Realize that you will not be able to anticipate every challenge which may arise, but be assured that almost anything can be worked out if you are resourceful and if you're committed to making your marriage work. Perhaps you're having a little too much fun being single, taking extravagant vacations, buying expensive cars and toys, and just generally enjoying the carefree life with your friends. I've encountered groups of you running around together. And I admit that I've wondered why you are not with the young ladies. Brethren, there is a point at which it's time to think seriously about marriage and to seek a companion with whom you want to spend eternity. If you choose wisely, and if you are committed to the success of your marriage, there's nothing in this life which will bring you greater happiness.
And the sad thing of it all is that Latter-day Saints have not been immune from these societal trends that are swirling all around us. Another one of these trends I might suggest is higher education, the degree to which people feel the need to go get this paper certificate and take out all this school debt to do so. The share of Americans, looking again at that 1980 starting point that a lot of these data snippets have had, the share of Americans with bachelor's degrees has nearly doubled since 1980, from 23% to 40%. The government has really been pushing this narrative that you need school. It's been financially incentivizing people, getting loans and their Pell Grants and everything else. And so you have a lot of people with this social reinforcement and expectation that, oh, you need a college degree to get ahead, and the government creating the incentives to push everyone down that trajectory. Not only does that dilute the potency and meaning of a college degree, if everyone basically has one, then who cares? But it's also altering people's behavior. And so for women in particular, school debt is a reason why they wait to get married and start having children. Here's a quote from the Institute for Family Studies. They said that it's possible that debt may also reduce fertility independently of marriage. Some studies show that student debt has a strong effect on delaying fertility. The economic rationale is simple. Having and raising children costs money, and student debt gobbles up a share of income right off the top of the budget. And so the student debt bubble, this massive financial push for people to indebt themselves to get this degree that often they don't need for the job that they get, right, has saddled people with debt and placed them early in their young single adult lives with a huge financial burden that for most of them is completely unnecessary, and yet skews their behavior, alters their decisions, and delays their family. So women who married later in life, as I mentioned earlier, this is also from the Institute for Family Studies, women who married later in life have fewer children. And even if they want more children, of course, if the window of time that they have available for fertility closes, that's, of course, going to impact the birth rate. Now, I did a musing back in February called Are Mormons the Best Breeders?, where we looked at some of the data about the birth rate. Here's just a tiny, tiny little sample. So since 2007, the U.S. birth rate in the United States has dropped 19%, just since 2007. And in the U.S. in 2014, for example, almost half of all women between the ages of 18 and 39 had no children. And that was a decade ago. And if the number falls below the population replacement rate, which is 2.1, then you start to get populations shrinking, and that creates a lot of problems, not only for social security type welfare programs that are really a pyramid scheme that depend on this ever increasing number of young people to support old people. It's why things are going so poorly in Japan and China and elsewhere, where you have so few taxable workers, productive workers, to finance this largesse of older people that expect to be taken care of. So it wreaks havoc on social systems that have created these pyramid schemes. But it also, if we're having fewer children, we're depriving our society of the innovation. I mean, abortion is, a crime for many reasons, but also like these kids being aborted or not being born at all. If you have families not having a lot of kids, those children, had they been born, could have gone on to be the next, Elon Musks or the next, Einsteins or whoever. And we're depriving our society of the contributions and the innovation of, no doubt, some amazing people. And when you look at the fertility rates across the whole world, what you see is what we saw in the other charts. Here, take a look at global fertility rates since the 1950s through the 60s. It's all flat, 4.5. We were at 4.5 average number of live births per woman. And then you get into, the early 70s, and you have this precipitous decline where we're now half a century later, about half a century later, we are below the population replacement rate. And we also have a rising number of people who don't even want to have kids. So 44% of people who are not parents that are age 18 to 49, they say that it's not too likely or not at all likely that they will have children someday. 44%. This is an increase of 7 percentage points from just 2018. So just a few years ago, it was 37%. Now it's 44% of non-parent adults, age 18-49, saying it's unlikely that they're going to have kids. So you had this increase just in the past few years. And of course, it's been an increase in the years prior to that as well. Now, as I said, with the example of Elder Monson, many church leaders have been speaking out about this over the decades. For example, in 2005, Elder Oaks gave some remarks at a fireside for the church educational system. It was like a devotional. And he was talking about the problems with youth today with dating, that there's this heavier emphasis in hanging out. He defined in his talk, because he's like, a bunch of you older folks don't understand what it means, so I'm going to define it. It's numbers of young men and numbers of young women joining together in some group activity. And he called dating an endangered species. And here's what he said. For many years, the church has counseled young people not to date before age 16. Perhaps some young adults, especially men, have carried that wise counsel to excess and determined not to date before 26 or maybe even 36. Men, he said, if you have returned from your mission and you are still following the boy-girl patterns you were counseled to follow when you were 15, it is time for you to grow up. Gather your courage and look for someone to pair off with. Start with a variety of dates with a variety of young women, and when that phase yields a good prospect, proceed to courtship. It's marriage time. That is what the Lord intends for his young adult sons and daughters. Men have the initiative, and you men should get on with it. If you don't know what a date is, perhaps this definition will help. I heard it from my 18-year-old granddaughter. A date must pass the test of 3 Ps: planned ahead, paid for, and paired off. So it's kind of funny when you have like an octogenarian, giving dating advice to 18-year-olds and 22-year-olds and so forth. But here he's talking about how this hanging out culture is a problem. There was a BYU study with the School of Family Life published in 2010 that validated these concerns. And this was just a few years after Elder Oaks said what he said. They found in this study that there are they identified 2 types of hanging out, each with very different purposes. The first type is what they called purposive hanging out. So hanging out on purpose. They say that it does have dating as an end goal. If young adults hang out with the intention of finding dates, the outcomes can be positive. So according to the study, this type of hanging out can help single adults to find and observe potential dating partners and then reduce the awkwardness of dating total strangers. When it works correctly, they said, purposeful hanging out leads to dating, so the hanging out stage is short-lived. By contrast, the other type of hanging out has much less purpose. They call it non-committal hanging out, which I gotta think is a play on non-committal making out. I remember when I was at BYU in whatever, 99, 2000, there was literally a website called nicmo.com or .org, non-committal makeout, and it was literally a social network for people to meet other people to make out. It was wildly popular on BYU campus. I won't reveal whether I participated in it or not, but, NICMO was a thing. And so you had non-committal making out. Now you have non-committal hanging out, apparently. The intention here is to avoid committing to a dating relationship. Participants in, instead of NICMO, I guess it would be NICHO, non-committal hanging out. They want to have fun, fill time, stay friends. This type of hanging out is all about the moment, but generally extends for a long period of time because you're not having this purposeful behavior trying to drive towards dating. Okay, let's wrap up with a few thoughts. So my overarching muse here, the thought that I had as I was reflecting on why the church made these changes, right? Because I believe, if it wasn't clear from all the data I shared and why I was sharing it, that the church here is responding to social and cultural trends. You have, outside of our church, across society, a rising age in marriage, people delaying family planning, delaying dating and getting married and having kids, and Latter-day Saints are not immune from that. The members of the church have been swept up in these cultural tides. They have been, seduced by these societal trends. They've at least not been immune to them. And that, to me, is the overarching observation, that how difficult it is for families, for youth in our church to hold those trends at bay, to abstain from being influenced by them, right? To be in the world and not of the world type of dynamic, and how difficult that is, right? When I did the music on abortion, I was talking and giving examples of how young adults in the church who consider themselves, faithful members are so-called pro-choice and being swept along with these social trends. And now we have the same with, gender stuff and climate change and all this stuff. All around us, there are these strong cultural forces and these social trends taking place. Many of them motivated, I think, for economic reasons, with the debasement of our monetary system and how that just radiates throughout society and corrupts society. So it's not like everyone's immune from it. Latter-day Saint young adults are part in the economy, right? And they're having to deal with their own dollars being devalued, and they're having to, potentially have mom and dad work together before having kids. So we can't be totally immune from the economic factors at play, which affect everybody else. But leaders have been kind of preaching about this and encouraging people, but it's still a problem, and it has necessitated or prompted the addition or the extension of age in which you can be a young single adult and still be in these wards, trying to get these people to still, date, still get married between the age of 30 to 35 before they then go to a mid-singles, whatever, or just, go inactive and get disconnected from the church. I was reminded of this tweet that I saw a couple years ago. Do married people watch Gen Z dating and feel like they caught the last chopper out of Vietnam? I thought it was hilarious, right? Because it's such a different world today. And from my younger brothers and people I know who are younger and colleagues and interns and whatever, like, it just sounds horrifying. And yet it's part of this broader trend of just societal degradation that we've had over the decades, and how young people are not immune from being impacted by the consequences of those trends. And so another concern I have is, how is the church responding to this? I had a lot of complaints and criticisms about Boy Scouts. I got my Eagle Scout. I went through the whole thing. I was in the Order of the Arrow. But there were a lot of redeeming virtues of it, especially when you had a good scout leader. My dad was our scoutmaster, and we did all kinds of amazing activities. And, I probably grumbled my way through a lot of them. But looking back, it was, especially for a young, scrawny, puny kid, it was good kind of strengthening experiences, pushing me out of my comfort zone and so forth. And so despite the downsides of how I think Boy Scouts was managed, it was a very solid program to help young men be men and to kind of man up and to be around other men and have these kind of adventurous activities. The young men's program today is a mess compared to even that, and is not well organized. I was in young men's for a while as a leader, and just kind of seeing what was happening. There was a lot of, and then talking to other people, to getting outside of my own little anecdote for our ward, trying to say what's happening elsewhere, and just again and again, especially from the parents of young men, hearing these concerns about how lethargic the program was, and how ineffective it was, at least by contrast with the Boy Scouts, if not as a standalone observation about the quality and performance of how we're supporting these young boys to become men in a society that feminizes and infantilizes them and does not emphasize and in fact criticizes men and manhood, and calling it toxic masculinity, and portraying all the men in, most entertainment as this, buffoon character. And so what is the church? What are we as a church community doing to abstain from those trends, to push against them and help our young men become men, to help our, daughters become amazing, strong women as well? And then I look at things like this. Here is a video from the Young Men General Presidency. Earlier this year, they finally decided to get onto social media, but it ended up, a lot of these videos are super awkward. Take a look.
Hi, we as a Young Men's General Presidency are here thinking about Easter, one of the great times of the year. I love Christmas, but if you think about it, the reason that Christmas is such an amazing time is because of what happened at Easter.
Think about Christmas. One of the reasons we love it is because we celebrate more than just one day. We're celebrating the whole month beforehand. In fact, my wife gets started at the end of Halloween. That's when she gets started. And so you've got to remember that you can celebrate Easter for the whole week before Easter and not just on Easter.
In the same way that over years we've studied the New Testament and the birth of Jesus Christ, we can also study in the Book of Mormon in the 11th chapter of 3rd Nephi about Jesus Christ and his resurrection.
It's such an amazing thing that unto us a child is born, but it's amazing because he is risen.
Happy Easter.
And there's other videos like that too. It doesn't come off in a way where my 15-year-old boy is like, really wanting to watch these videos and feeling connected to these like much older individuals. That we gotta play the influencer game. We gotta have young people connecting with other young people and showing what it's like to be a young person who's faithful, right, and who's proceeding down the covenant path and everything. And so having the Young Men General Presidency do these like awkward old man type videos, to me, it just suggests that we have a lot of challenges in how our church is dealing with young people, teenagers and young adults, and just extending the age in the hopes that gives people more time to date, get married. Like, sure, that's fine. But in a sense, maybe it's rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic if it's sinking. So we need systemic, type change. We need something much bigger because we're losing our youth. They are being bombarded by these social, cultural messages from, TikTok and all the rest and their peers. And I feel like the church is, playing behind, whatever the term is. Playing behind the 8 ball is what comes to mind, but maybe I'm using that term wrong. We're kind of falling behind. We're not, in there really competing in a very effective way. So I don't want to be overly critical. I'm sure there's a lot of well-meaning people in, church bureaucracy that are trying to launch different initiatives and social media channels and things to help. But from my vantage point and talking with a lot of parents of teenagers and young adults, there's a lot of problems, and we're increasingly losing a number of them. And what does that mean for the future of the church? What does that mean for those individuals who we're losing, who, if we had done something better, stronger, more ideal, whatever, we could have held on to them and they could have had this amazing impact to spread the gospel and these principles to others. So I'll wrap there. I have some people in my life who fit into this category. I'm sure you do as well. I'll be very curious to see how this plays out. But one of my overarching concerns here is that these trends have been going on for decades, and I don't see them plateauing. I don't see them course correcting. So what does the world look like in a decade with these trends continuing, or half a century? What does the church look like in a decade or half a century if all of these trends with marriage and children and the economy and so forth continue? It's going to look a lot different, and I don't think in a good way. So how can we withstand this? How can we push back against it? How can we raise awareness so that we're not just swept along with every wind of doctrine, buffeted about by these social trends, but helping our youth especially stand firm, counteract these trends, resist them and not be swept along by them. I would love to know in the comments what your thoughts are. If you have people in your life who this affects, what your observations are about what we're doing with the youth and the young adults in the church and what we could do. What are some ideas of how we could improve this? I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you next Sunday.